this afternoon, what I'm going to be focusing on is just to give you sort of a state of current orphan affairs and talk a little bit about where we are with respect to implementing many of the FDASIA provisions from the recent legislation that was passed. It's an area of interest for a lot of folks, questions that we get a lot. Just as the interest in rare diseases has really blossomed in industry, likewise at FDA, there are a number of offices within the agency now that focus on rare diseases. 30 years ago, my office, the Office of Orphan Products Development, was the only one that really focused on rare diseases. And now there are multiple offices throughout the agency that do. We now have a CDER, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, have a rare disease program. We have a representative from there here as well. There is, OSHI has been rebranded into the Office of Health and, you would think I would know the name, it's Health and Constituent Affairs. They deal with a lot of patient concerns, and we are seeing increasing patient interactions with rare disease patients both in our office and in their office as well. After 2 days at this conference, I think you are all experts at this point, but a very, very quick recap. As we all know, a drug is designated as an orphan if it is intended to treat a rare disease, and rare is defined statutorily as treating under 200,000 patients in the United States, and has already been previously discussed. When a drug is designated, there are many financial incentives that go along with designation. We've heard about this, the tax credits, the waiver of user fees, which now, with the passage of FDASIA, the fees are in the $1.9 million range, and the 7-year market exclusivity. Interestingly, the 7-year market exclusivity remains a really important incentive for the development of these products. We see races to see who's the first on the market. There are lots of discussions when there are Me Too products that are coming on the market as to whether they are clinically superior and therefore deserve exclusivity. So after designation, orphan drugs can be and often are eligible for many of the other expedited pathways through the agency: fast track, priority review, accelerated approval, all things that folks here are probably intimately familiar with. And I wanted to reiterate that the standard for approval remains substantial evidence of safety and effectiveness. Back when the Orphan Drug Act was passed 30 years ago, there was a lot of discussion as to whether the standard should be lowered or changed for orphan drugs, primarily because of the same things we hear now. There are small populations, hard to study, should the standard be lowered? And that was considered and rejected at that point. Having said that, the agency has and continues to exercise a fair degree of flexibility in reviewing orphan applications to see if the standard of safety and effectiveness has been met. This is to illustrate sort of where we are right now in terms of designations and approvals. As you can see, the number of designations have really gone up over the years. There was a slight dip last year, but it's really on par with where we've been in the last couple of years. One of the things we're interested to see is with the development of targeted therapies, whether that number is going to go up, and if it does go up, is it going to be for what one would typically think of as a historical rare disease like a Duchenne's or a Huntington's, or whether we're going to start seeing more and more designations for more common diseases, but sort of smaller pies, smaller slices of the pie of common diseases. So that's something we're interested in and looking at. And similarly, as you start developing more Me Too products, both in the biologic space as well as the drug space, again, it will impact on not just whether or not you get exclusivity upon approval, but whether or not you're eligible for designation in the first place. So those are some things we're interested in keeping an eye out for. And last year we've seen 26 approvals in orphan drugs, and we'll talk a little bit more about the breakdown of that. In terms of what we were designating, I don't think this will come as any surprise. We looked at 2012 data. By and large, we are designating oncology products. They represented a little over a third, followed by neurology products and hematology products. And in the next couple of slides I've gotten from my CEDAR colleagues, this sort of looks at the breakdown of approvals over from 2008 to 2013, and you sort of see the similar breakdown that by and large, the bulk of the orphan drugs that are being approved are oncology products, followed by neurology, followed by hematology. This, again, gives sort of a different cut of the data, and it really looks to see of the approvals, how many were new molecular entities versus repurposed. As you can see, about half, in 2012 there were 26 approvals, and about half are new molecular entities, and a little less than that are repurposed. And of the 39 new molecular entities that were approved last year, a third were for rare diseases. So a big chunk of what the agency is approving is in the rare disease space, and we expect that to continue. A quick note about our grants program. You know, FDA is not, everyone knows NIH is the funding agency, not FDA, but we do have a grants program that was implemented back when the Orphan Drug Act was passed to promote research and development in this space. And, you know, compared to other budgets, it's a very modest budget. Ours is $14 million, but we've made those dollars go quite a long way. The success of this program has really been pretty tremendous. About 49 approvals of the 400 plus that have been approved to date, about 49, we funded in part some of those approvals. Just last year, 2 of the 26 approvals received some of our grant funding. For those of you who are here with industry, you might be interested to know that we actually fund industry as well, go figure. But the next submission date is February 2014, so you know, keep that in mind if this is something that folks are interested in. I will be honest and say with sequestration, we have taken a hit on the grants program, so we've seen a decrease in our budget, but we are hoping to make our dollars go as far as they can. Just a quick slice of what we're funding through our grants program. Over half are drugs, and the others are biologics and devices. We also do fund studies in medical foods as well. So that's sort of a very quick slice of where we are in terms of numbers. I wanted to spend some more of my time talking about FDASIA provisions for rare diseases. As most of you know, FDASIA was passed this past July, and in it was pretty historic. It really contained a lot of provisions in the legislation that were really focused on or very applicable to rare diseases. And likewise, the performance goals that the agency agreed to as part of the PDUFA negotiations really contained a focus on rare diseases as well. So here are just a couple, I think this captures, you know, the bulk of the provisions in FDASIA and the PDUFA performance goals that really do relate to rare diseases. The ones that are sort of bracketed are the ones I'll talk about in a little bit more detail. A quick note that we were very happy that there was a point where we were worried whether our grants programs would get reauthorized, but it has been reauthorized, so we're good for another 5 years. Here's hoping the appropriations stay put. The first that I'll talk about is breakthrough therapies. This is one of the provisions that has really generated a lot of interest in industry. Everybody asks us questions about this, so I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about it. So what this provision does is it allows the agency to designate a drug as a breakthrough therapy if, one, it's intended to treat a serious or life-threatening disease or condition. So it's not limited to rare diseases, but obviously the vast majority of rare diseases do fit into that category. And there is some preliminary clinical data. So there has to be some clinical data that indicates that the drug may demonstrate substantial improvement over existing therapies on one or more clinically significant endpoints. So again, there's got to be some clinical evidence, and it's got to demonstrate some substantial improvement over what's already available. So as part of the package for this designation, a sponsor needs to provide justification for what that endpoint is and also provide some brief statistical analysis. Now, this request can be submitted either through an IND or it could be submitted later in an amendment. And so you submit this designation and you get designated. What does that get you? It gets you everything that fast-track designation gets you. So frequent meetings, frequent written correspondence with FDA. The drug is eligible for accelerated approval. It's also eligible for rolling review, so you could submit parts of the application to the agency. But what it also gets you is it's everything that fast track gets. I guess I think of it as fast track on steroids. It gets you everything that fast track gets you, but a lot more interaction with the agency and engagement at the very senior levels of the review division to really ensure that there's efficient drug development. Like I said, this has generated a lot of interest to date, and this is since the legislation passed in July. The agency has received a total of 40 requests for designation. The vast majority are in CEDAR. 10 have been designated. Those 2 are in CEDAR, and 12 have been denied. The remainder, the 18, are still pending decisions. The agency has 60 days to make a decision. The next provision I wanted to touch on is accelerated approval. As most of you know, the agency has had authority to approve a product based on accelerated approval. What FDASIA did was it really codified in the law this accelerated approval provision, but really also specified and called out that in considering whether or not accelerated approval is appropriate to take into account severity, rarity, prevalence, as well as a lack of alternative treatment. So again, you're starting to see a real emphasis on rare diseases in the law. The next provision that we are getting a lot of questions about is the Rare Pediatric Disease Priority Review Voucher applications. That's a bit of a mouthful. The point of this voucher was really to encourage the treatments for rare pediatric diseases. It basically works like this. If you are a drug intended to treat a rare pediatric disease and you end up getting approved for that rare pediatric indication, what that gets you is a voucher, and that voucher can then be used, can then be transferred or used for another product that wouldn't otherwise get priority review. Now, how does one go about getting this rare pediatric disease priority review voucher? We're still in the process of sort of working out how this should be implemented, but the statute, it's a little bit unclear about how this should work. The statute says that you could request for designation as a rare pediatric disease at the time you request orphan drug designation or fast track designation, but you don't have to get designated. It's not a prerequisite in order to be eligible for this voucher. So the statute defines what a rare pediatric disease is. It's a disease that primarily affects individuals aged birth to 18 years. This birth to 18 years is a little bit of a departure from how CDER normally looks at pediatrics, which is typically defined as 0 to 16 years. So this is a little bit different. And one of the things to consider in implementing this is how do you define whether a disease primarily affects individuals within this age. Is it age of onset? Is it when the manifestation appears? Is it the mere virtue of having that genetic mutation? How do you define what primarily affects means? So not only do you have to meet the definition of a rare pediatric disease, at the time that you submit your application, there are certain criteria that the application has to satisfy in order to qualify as a rare pediatric disease product application. The drug has to be an NME. The application has to be a 505(b)(1) or a 351A. It has to be eligible for priority review. There has to be clinical data from studies in a pediatric population. And the application does not seek approval for an adult indication. And again, it's this last prong that still needs to be worked out, how it's going to be implemented. Next, I wanted to talk about the patient-focused drug development. As part of what the agency negotiated in terms of its performance goals in PDUFA, the agency agreed to conduct 20 meetings on different diseases. And the whole point was to pick 20 diseases and to really get patient input on those diseases, how it's impacted their daily living, how available therapies are working for them, what's important to patients. This generated a lot of interest in the patient community and a lot of controversy because there was this thought that, here's a list of 20 and you got to do your best to get on this list, and if you don't, you're out of luck. That was really not what the intent was. This was really intended to sort of be a pilot of how to get input from patients on different diseases and to sort of serve as a model for how such input can be garnered from the patient community. And so this list, it's not limited to rare diseases. It's intended to include both common and rare. Back in September, they published this preliminary list. I think it was over 30 diseases. There were a number of rare diseases listed in that preliminary list. And then the agency had an open public hearing about it to get input on this list. And there was a public docket. We received over 4,500 comments to the docket. And incidentally, the first meeting is scheduled. The first of the 20 is scheduled for this April in a couple of weeks. Again, it's not on necessarily on a rare disease or condition. It's on chronic fatigue syndrome and myalgic encephalomyelitis. But we're very interested to see how this meeting goes because, again, it'll sort of serve as a model for how other such meetings are going to progress. Hot off the presses, today they published in the Federal Register the diseases that the agency will focus on from 2013 to 2015. There's still some more to be published, and of the list, I've listed out the ones that were rare that will be discussed, and as you can see, there are a fair bit. They haven't been scheduled yet. The first one on narcolepsy will likely happen sometime in September of 2013, and the other ones will be scheduled sometime in 2014 or 2015. So these should be very interesting meetings. And lastly, because it's sort of the end of the day, if you could indulge me, I did want to end on a bit of a sentimental note. This year marks the 30th anniversary of the Orphan Drug Act. I know a lot of the conversations today has really been centered around, the interest in orphan drugs, pipelines, payment, and it's just really crazy to see how much this area has exploded. When you hear about what things were like 30 years ago, before the Orphan Drug Act was passed, fewer than 10 products were developed by industry in the decade prior to the passage of the Orphan Drug Act. So we've come a long way. And to commemorate the 30 years, what we did was we recognized 30 rare disease heroes who've really contributed to the progress that we've made, and we've tried to take a really wide swath. We've tried to recognize patient advocates, researchers, clinicians, industry, government officials, the wide swath, and these folks were really intended to represent the larger patient community, industry community, clinician community, and researcher community. So we thank them for all of their efforts. And with that, I will stop, and I've got a few more minutes to spare. If you have any questions, feel free to visit our website. We have an email address, and call us. We get calls and emails all the time, and we do our best to get back to folks on a fairly quick turnaround.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for maybe one or two questions,
Sure.
if there are any from the audience.
I've answered everything and left nobody in doubt of anything.
Question?
Just a comment.
Oh,
It took maybe 20 years for the momentum to really explode. In 30 years, just have you look in your crystal ball. Is the Orphan Drug Act going to be a victim of its own success? As technology improves and we become more able to target, identify, develop drugs, and personalize our medicine, are we really going to see this eventually perhaps really morph into something completely different or disappear because we've been so successful?
You know, what's interesting is a lot of the conversations that we're having internally about how everything's going to be an orphan eventually, and what does that mean for the incentives associated with the Act? Does everything now all of a sudden get 7 years of exclusivity and user fee waivers? And so that's an interesting philosophical question. You know, I don't think we're anywhere close to that, but it'll be interesting to see where it's going to go. Like I said, we are sort of keeping an eye out on targeted therapies to see, are we starting to see more and more designations where we're looking at a smaller slice of, say, lung cancer or non-small cell lung cancer as opposed to, again, like a Duchenne's.
Excuse me, as it relates to the disease-specific panels or discussions, you mentioned narcolepsy, likely the first one. Can you give us a sense as to the scope or the intent or, you know, kind of the framework that these meetings are going to be held at, and what's the ultimate goal coming out of them?
Sure. Before each meeting, there should be a Federal Register notice that comes out that will really try to list out what the area of focus is going to be on each of the different diseases. The primary goal is really to hear from patients as well as other stakeholders. But again, it's patient-focused drug development. So we really want to hear from patients about their experiences. And again, it's really looking at symptoms, how are therapies working for them, sort of those types of intangibles. If you look at the earlier Federal Register notice, there were certain categories, and thinking about how to come up with a list of 20, there was a lot of thought into how to come up with those 20. In terms of what we're going to do with this information, it's really going to guide decision-making at the agency as they're looking at products. And again, these 20 are not intended to be an exclusive list. It's really intended to serve as a model for how that type of information can be used for other diseases.
Yeah, hello. Two quick questions, in fact. One is to follow up on this patient-focused meeting.
Mm-hmm.
Could you elaborate a little bit more about the other participants in addition to the patient representatives that you're planning to have in these meetings? And also on the outcomes, so in fact I'm following up very much on that question. The output of this meeting, how will that be used in the regulatory context? Will it be helpful to shape the points to consider for the regulators after that in their dialogue with the companies, or
Yes. In terms of who else will be involved, I think it'll vary from disease to disease, but patients, certainly, patient advocacy groups, as well as researchers, industry. So I think it depends on who the level of interest that's generated, and I'm not sure that it's been worked out yet how they're going to decide who speaks, et cetera. And in terms of the output of this, again, we're still learning the agency's still learning as they go. And I think part of the hope of what this information is going to do is to help establish endpoints that patients care about, what type of patient-reported outcomes they should be focusing on, that sort of thing.
Then, if I may, is that for me, it sounds very much like the already existing workshops organized by the EMA on some disease-specific area, where they bring together patient representatives, clinicians, industry, in order to discuss the points to consider in the clinical development of products for that condition. And if I'm mentioning that here, it's that because I mentioned yesterday in the discussion already that one thing that we would like to see as a patient organization is precisely a collaboration between FDA and EMA on these points to consider based on the feedback, on the contribution from the community of that disease. Because as we are not very successful on the joint protocol assistance or things like that, having it more before at an early stage, that gives us really a chance to have a better, not harmonization, but dialogue on the regulatory aspects of development. And my second question is more on the pediatric priority review voucher. I'd like to understand more the rationale of why the FDA and the stakeholders like NORD and others and industry pushed for that voucher. What is really the issue that we're trying to address here that was not addressed with the existing incentive of the orphan drug designation, or also provided in terms of compulsory study with the pediatric regulation?
I can only speculate as to what the thinking was in passing this provision. My understanding is there was this thought that not enough was being focused on, that in spite of the incentives associated with the Orphan Drug Act, there wasn't as much of a focus on rare pediatric diseases, that they were somehow getting left behind. And so this idea was really in part modeled after the Tropical Disease Voucher Program that currently exists. That program hasn't really taken off. There's only been 2 such vouchers awarded since its inception. But part of the thinking was part of the limitation of that voucher program was there was a real limitation on the transferability of that voucher. And so this program takes that limitation away and makes transferability more flexible. And so the idea is that this would then be a way to generate more interest and hopefully more funding for development of products. But I'm speculating.
Thank you very much.